I thought it was amazing. And this specific chapter, I thought it was very very transformative. She touched upon many important features of this relationship that I, to a certain extent, I didn't think about before, or I really haven't, I had not reflected upon that intensively. So I hope we can spark some discussion today based on what I would like to show you. And I would like to start this talk by looking at this relief. This is a relief that depicts a healing scene. Here in the foreground, you see Asclepius, which is the god of medicine and the healing hero in ancient Greece. And you see that Asclepius is healing a sick woman's shoulder by appearing in her dream. He's touching that shoulder. And in the background, the patient is asleep, right? While a serpent, which symbolizes medicine as a discipline, a craft, science, physically affects the healing, biting the shoulder of that woman. So in here we see, in the lower part, you can see the rod of Asclepius with a coiled serpent, which is the ancient Greek symbol associated with medicine. And I wanted to start the talk showing that, just to highlight the fact that different cultures have, for the longest time, associated healing with deities and the supernatural. And physicians have been considered a vessel, the effectors of divine intervention, and utilized by gods or God as mediators for cure and health restoration. So it is, to a certain extent, magical, we would say, the relationship between a physician and a patient. And most outcomes in medicine can be weighted, measured, accurately described, tested, reproduced. However, I think the patient-physician relationship doesn't seem to be one of those outcomes that can be weighted, measured, and accurately reproduced. So this relationship has been defined as a consensual relationship in which the patient knowingly seeks the physician's assistance, and in which the physician knowingly accepts the person as a patient. So at its core, the patient-physician relationship represents a fiduciary relationship in which, by entering into that relationship, the physician agrees to respect the patient's autonomy, to maintain the confidentiality of that patient, explain treatment options, obtain informed consent, provide the highest standard of care, and to commit not to abandon the patient without adequate time to find a replacement. However, such a contractual definition, in my opinion, fails to portray the immense and profound nature of this relationship. Patients sometimes reveal secrets, worries, and fears to physicians that they have not yet disclosed to friends or family members. And they place a lot of trust, in a physician that, can help them regain their health and well-being. And that relationship actually can be therapeutic. So there are different models of patient-physician relationship that have been described. And here we have the most commonly listed ones. The active-passive model is the oldest of the three models, and it's based on the physician acting upon the patient, who is treated as an object, almost. This model may be appropriate nowadays, rarely during an emergency when the patient may be, unconscious, or when a delay in treatment may cause irreparable harm. In such situations, consent is waived. There are no complicated conversations, and the physician proceeds to take care of that patient, acting on his or her best interest, patient's best interest. Then there is the guidance cooperation model, in which the physician is placed in a position of power still due to having medical knowledge that the patient typically lacks. and the physician is expected to decide what is in the patient's best interest and to make recommendations accordingly. The patient is expected to comply with these recommendations. It is still an unbalanced model for cooperation. And we're moving, as the years pass by and we evolve and understand more about this relationship, we're moving towards the mutual cooperation, mutual participation model, which is based on an equal partnership between the doctor and the patient. So the patient is viewed as an expert in his or her own life experiences and goals. And it's important to make the patient involved to design a treatment plan, right? So the physician's role is to elicit the patient's goals and to help to achieve these goals. And this model requires that both parties have equal power, are mutually interdependent, and engage in activities that are equally satisfying to both. While each of these models may be appropriate in specific situations, again, over the last several decades, we have been increasingly supporting the mutual participation model whenever it is medically feasible. And this unique relationship encompasses 4 key elements: mutual knowledge, trust, loyalty, and regard, right? So knowledge refers to the physician's knowledge of the patient as well as the patient's knowledge of the physician. Trust involves the patient's faith in the physician's competence and caring, as well as the physician's trust in the patient and his or her beliefs and report of symptoms. Regard implies that the patients feel as though the physician likes them as individuals and is on their side. And loyalty refers to the patient's willingness to forgive a physician for any inconvenience or mistake, and the physician's commitment not to abandon a patient. These 4 elements constitute the foundation of the physician-patient relationship. However, perhaps the empathic component of this relationship should not be overstated, right? As many other relationships, this one is rooted in the ability of both individuals, but to a greater extent, the ability of the physician to empathize with the patient in order to establish an optimal therapeutic relationship. And empathy is a primal and yet complex capability that mammals evolved to display. Not all animals display empathy. Mammals have the ability to mirror and model others' behaviors, perhaps pressured by the need to care for their own offspring. So parenting in mammalian life fundamentally requires empathy, and empathic parents are naturally more likely to have a more successful offspring that will reach adulthood. So empathy plays a role, has played a role in evolution. And here we can see depicted many empathic animal behaviors. You will see mirroring, yawn contagion. These are examples of motor mimicry that are empathic behaviors. You see estate matching and consolation that results from emotional contagion, again, manifestations of empathy. But ultimately, these biological traits have been perfected by humans, right? And they put us in an evolutionary advantage. And this is, to your left, you see this Russian model depicting the various components of the empathetic response, which have been added layer upon layer during evolution and remain functionally integrated in us. So at the core of the doll, you can see the perception action mechanism, which induces a similar emotional state in the observer as in the target. You see a emotion, you observe it, and then you feel it. It's an emotional contagion situation, right? We yawn when we see others yawn. We feel instantly sad when we see displays of sadness. This is a very primal reaction, and it is elicited by our limbic central nervous system. Those outer layers then, they start to show more of a cortical, I would say, coordination, right? You see empathetic concern and consolation, and then perspective taking and targeted helping. These are empathic traits that require a more elaborate emotional regulation. You need to have the self-other distinction and cognition. So I'm not a neurobehavioral scientist. I don't claim to be one, but I'm fascinated by how elaborate and complex it is the biological basis of empathic behavior. And I think by understanding the 3 types of empathy, it becomes very clear that being an empathetic person is not a simple personality trait, right? It's a package of skills that combines biological non-negotiables of neurons and genes and the development of neural pathways, and also the executive function of perspective taking. So in order for reflexive empathy, right, which is, I see sadness, I feel sad. So in order for reflexive empathy to build to emotional empathy, the mirror neurons in the premotor area of the brain must develop a strong connection to the limbic system. So the limbic system is here, and you have, the prefrontal cortex in here, the premotor area here, and our temporal lobe. The cortical area of the brain has to develop a strong connection to the limbic system and process emotional aspects of empathy. So this connection occurs via neural pathways in the insular cortex depicted here. So it's very biological to a certain extent. But the good news is that we can actually develop and strengthen the executive functions of empathy, such as perspective taking. So, right. So there's scientific work that has demonstrated that empathy can be honed in and boosted by practice and reinforcement of these neuronal connections and pathways that you see here. And perspective taking is the practice of trying to infer and understand another person's feelings, thoughts, and viewpoint without directly experiencing it. This is arguably one of the most teachable and trainable empathic skills. And the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget postulated that human infants, they only have one perspective, their own, right? They're profoundly egocentric. They're unable to comprehend that someone may have a different experience from their own. So they're unable to take another person's perspective. However, between ages 3 and 5, children begin to develop what's called the theory of mind. They start to recognize that other people have their own minds and they can have other perspectives different from their own. And this is a very important milestone in neurocognitive development. So in order for perspective taking to occur, knowledge or the ability to imagine what the other's point of view is 100% required. And this is a key concept that I want to stress: knowledge, right? When we are unable to obtain a more complete assessment of a patient's history, we may incur in errors of judgment that impact our ability to provide recommendations that address those important points. So patients do have a history. They have a baggage of past experiences. We all have preferences, cultural values, traditions that modulate many things, including how diseases manifest. So it's crucial for the physician to understand that in order to establish a therapeutic patient-physician relationship. And because it is crucial for the physician to have that knowledge in order to exercise perspective taking, we will discuss how we can improve or hone in the ability to obtain that kind of knowledge. There are many moving parts that need to be fully functioning when physicians interact with patients in order to for that exchange to prove fruitful to both physician and patient, right? And in order for the physician to efficiently acquire knowledge of the patient's self, there are substantial levels of attention, relaxation, and intellectual and emotional engagement that are required for a successful interaction. So you could call this bringing your whole self to that encounter that Dr. Cooper fully describes that experience in the book, and the need for it to occur for the engagement with patients to be optimal. So empathy will put this engine in motion, and if all conditions are fulfilled, the process will take place. However, both internal and external factors can disrupt this optimal interplay and hinder the process. And here we have some examples of barriers, such as time constraints. For instance, if you have only 10 to 15 minutes to interact with a patient, it may be very challenging to achieve a connection. Constant interruptions during the interaction. If you get paged or called in the middle of a conversation with a patient, you may not achieve the connection that you would like to achieve. Negative biases can be a very important hindrance, right? Positive bias towards patients will facilitate the engagement. You're going to feel relaxed, you'll feel comfortable with that patient, but when the bias is negative, you do just the opposite. And finally, burnout. It's very important to touch on this specific potential hindrance because it's an ever more prevalent condition among healthcare professionals. And it's a condition that has been well described as a cause of diminished empathic behavior, not only towards patients, but also towards peers and self. So burnout physicians ultimately become disconnected from their own needs and become unable to properly recognize the needs of others. So they acquire an apathetic behavior. So a discipline that has gained traction over the past decades is narrative medicine. It's structured on the premises that the effective practice of medicine requires narrative competence, that is, the ability to acknowledge, absorb, interpret, and act on the stories of others. So medicine practice with narrative competence has been proposed as a new model for humane and effective medical practice. And it is actually being taught and introduced in some medical schools. It focuses on methods such as close reading of literature and reflective writing. And it provides tools for physicians to examine 4 of the medicine's central narrative situations, which are the relationship with the patient, but also the relationship with self and with colleagues and relationship with society. And when we set ourselves to purposefully narrate, so when we think about narrating a situation, narrating an episode, narrating an interaction, narrating an encounter, we instantly become moved by curiosity, and narrating naturally promotes perspective taking skills. So ultimately, one of the major purposes of this approach, which is a somewhat new approach, is to rescue the humanistic foundations necessary for a healthier professional life. So promoting narrative medicine takes physicians beyond a diagnosis, a medical record number, pathology report. It brings them to patients' plots and its characters and the metaphors involved with many situations. And ultimately, it can help physicians to, by cooperating with patients and peers and to identify meaning to events, such as suffering and death, which is so important. And the practice of narrative medicine is the practice of presence, curiosity, listening, reflection, and it has the capability to ignite empathetic behavior in patients towards their physicians, towards themselves, to increase trust, right? Now, recommendations provided by someone who's knowledgeable about me as a patient, right, may have meaning. And exchanging information with that provider is now valuable because I feel myself heard. So it's a very interesting approach to patient relationship, physician-patient relationship in the current era. So to finalize, I would like to leave you with this quote from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So, and that's that's it for now. I will take any questions that the group may have. Trying to go back here to the meeting control.
Thanks, Dr. Bruno.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions or comments? Are there any physicians in the room that want to provide some perspective?
I have a question. I'm not a physician, but I've obviously noticed that my doctor visits are shorter and shorter these days, and mostly the physician is typing into a computer and not looking at me, and sometimes it's been really bad. But I just wonder, like, to do this sort of empathetic process of really beginning to understand the person's motivations and emotions, it takes time. And the medical world doesn't pay you to take that time, right? RVUs are different. Well, I mean, they get in the way. So how can we get around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer. It's complicated, of course, I would say. Definitely, you know, there are patterns. You're going to see very efficient physicians, and you know, you sit in that waiting room, and when it's time for you to be seen, you are roomed and you are seen. And it's most of the physicians, though, that are able to really develop an empathetic behavior and relationship with their patients, they run late. They are considered to be a bit inefficient, and I've had patients mad, you know, when they meet me for the first time. You know, sometimes I waited more than an hour to see you, and when I sit down and I start talking to them, the first thing I say is that, yeah, but now I'm all yours. We're going to talk now, and you know, I'm going to leave the room when all the questions have been answered, and that's what we're going to do. And then I'm going to be late 1.5 hours for the next, you know, appointment. Is this optimal? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We should be able to have more time to engage with patients. But I think you start building the relationship, you know, little by little. You know, that first encounter is very important, but every time a patient comes back, you ask a question that is really important, right? You know, what about that wedding? How was the wedding? Let me see, how was your outfit? You know, things like, you know, what are you doing, you know, this weekend? Or, you know, what are your goals, you know, in 6 months from now, depending on what kind of diseases you treat and patients that you see. But I think it's a gradual process too, and one that we can build upon in our 20-minute follow-ups. You know, every time we see a patient or a phone call that we make, we end up strengthening that relationship as time passes by. But the first appointment, the first encounter is extremely important, I would say. And I've failed at many, you know, first encounters. I definitely, you know, you can't engage for one reason or another. It's not that day. And it takes a while to rescue that interaction and bring it back to a place where it can be beneficial for the patient.
And is there any room for negotiating that first appointment be a longer appointment for that very reason? your
We-
employer.
So Claire, I don't want to get into trouble here, but we're losing more and more our autonomy when it comes to, deciding, how long we're going to go. I tend to put my, I tend to see my new patients at the end of the day. It's a strategy that I use. So I don't have a patient waiting for a short follow-up after that. So they are seeing back-to-back new patients at the end of the day. That gives me a little bit more of a wiggle room if I, go beyond that time allotted. I'm still okay, but it's not a whole lot of autonomy when it comes to deciding, how much time we can spend with new patients.
Yeah, thank you.
We could, this is Dave Aaron, I'm a mercifully retired physician. We can spend longer time with patients and just make less money. And
Yeah.
but I think what's underlying these kinds of questions gets to my view that the healthcare system is not broken. It's not broken at all. It does exactly what it's designed to do. And it is not designed to provide healthcare. That's one of its things. But remember, your cost is someone else's revenue. And that's what drives the way we organize healthcare. That doesn't mean, though, as a physician, you can't do the best you can. And I've made it, I'm an endocrinologist, and I made it my practice to try to get every single patient in every single encounter to at least chuckle at some time during the visit. Now, if I was telling them they had cancer, it was not so easy to do, but I even succeeded occasionally then. And that just makes a huge difference. Sit down at their level as a physician. Don't look down on them. Don't have them be completely undressed when you first go into the room, which is much more efficient, but you set up a situation in which one party is extremely vulnerable. So there are a lot of things that you can do. You can also work for a healthcare system that has a greater interest in healthcare as opposed to, say, profit. And my career was entirely with the VA.
David, did you want to touch on your question you asked in the chat?
Oh, sure. We hear now about precision medicine. And how a patient feels about life, their cultural background, their socioeconomic circumstances affect how they manifest a particular condition. That suggests to me that this idea of gene-based precision medicine is being wildly oversold.
Yeah, I think they're complementary. I think definitely biologically speaking, we are starting to understand diseases that in the past we felt were homogeneous, and now we are starting to understand they're highly heterogeneous based on the molecular profile of, like I treat lung cancers, for instance, right? So we have so many different molecular profiles that in the end provide us with keys to targeted treatments that not only are more effective, but also better tolerated than what we had in the past, which was, chemotherapy. We still use it now, but, we not to the extent that we used to use in the past. But that's just the biological part of the puzzle, right? So we have the holism, I would say, wholesomeness of the patient, and how the patient brings to that encounter so many important pieces of information that you have to get to learn in order to understand, for instance, that, acne as a side effect of this pill. I'm not going to lose my hair. Not going to lose my hair taking this medication, but acne is a big deal for me. And if it goes, if it takes over my face and nothing is done about it promptly, I'm going to stop taking the medication. I might not go back to that medication. Or if I take a medication that makes me super tired, energy levels from me are so important because of this and that. And so you have to understand the concerns and sometimes financial concerns. There are patients who sometimes skip taking certain types of medications because they're concerned about not being able to pay for them, right? And that affects the outcomes, for that patient. So I think it's a wonderful question, David. But I agree with you. It can't be all technicality. It cannot be all, let me check your profile, your genomic profile, and this is the recipe for you specifically. I think it's definitely more complex than that. And what is difficult sometimes also, and turns to be a reason for burnout at times, is to keep up with the advances, right, that are occurring in all fields, and still be able to engage empathetically with your patient, and be the bridge, between the biological aspects of what you are trying to achieve, but also the humanistic side of the patient. And there's a lot that patient will bring to the table, and you need to know in order to help. I don't know if I was able to cover that somehow, or.
So I'd like to make two other points if I could. Well, one point and one story. So one point, you used the word complex, and I think that is absolutely spot on. One of the things that makes a complex system complex is that it is not the sum of its parts. It is often, we typically say it's greater than the sum of its parts, but at least it ain't the same as it ain't the same as the sum of its parts. There are many, many interactions, and those interactions really govern how a whole person behaves. And I won't give a plug for my book on complex systems in medicine, The Hedgehog's Tale by me. Okay, but that's beside the point. If you can download it for free, by the way, from Springer Link.
Thank you.
But let me tell you a story. So as I was approaching my 40th year as an endocrinologist, and I don't keep up with things. Okay, I'm not a fool. I'm not, I understand. And I would still precept an endocrine clinic. And I would tell the other attendings that, you don't really need me anymore. You're up to date. You know what you're doing. And we had two attendings, and each of them said, Dr. Aaron, we like having you around. What we can offer with that I think has helped me prevent some burnout is that we can outthink people who know only the technicalities. So
true. So true. And And absolutely, and I mean, we would be lying if we would say that we don't get a lot from our, not all of the, encounters we have with our patients, but a lot of our patients, they energize us, and when put in at difficult times in their lives, and how they react to, I'm almost like a passive observer of, I see how people react to difficult times, and the families, and how they engage, and you see pretty much everything, right? After a while, you see not
Yeah.
I mean, a lot, you see a lot, but some of those interactions, some of those reactions, how they decide to deal with the facts they have in front of them, can be very, I would say, the information that you get can be almost revolutionary to you. The way you're taking that information and bring to your life, it's something that can be extremely rewarding, I would say. And I've that's one of the reasons why I think I do what I do. A lot of the reward really comes from that, seeing people dealing with tough.
Yeah, I don't miss EHRs, but I still miss my patients.
Yeah, EHRs are, and unfortunately they're not going to go anywhere. But
Thank you for the discussion. We do have another question in the chat. If Hattie, would you like to state your question?
Oh, yes. So basically my question was that empathy, we're talking about it in health professionals, but there's other professions that are very heavy in human interaction, such as people who deal with a lot of customers on a daily basis, and coaches. For example, my cross-country coach in high school, every time I tell this story to people who went to school with me, they always tell me, well, he was put in a difficult position, but honestly, I just think he completely lacked empathy, because one time my father put his nose in my mileage and he was being overprotective. My cross-country coach came up with a plan for me, and then I followed that plan for a couple of days. Actually, I messed my words. I meant to say I did not follow it for a couple of days because it was based off of what my father told him. I feel like I had a right to. He just got very irritated, and he didn't take into account like what I was going on, what was happening to me in my house at all. And he basically just treated me the same as he would like treat everyone else, basically like a factory unit. Basically, my question is just that for people who are terrible at expressing empathy, do you think it would be better if they train themselves to be more empathetic, or if they should just try not to taint that profession further and consider a different one that doesn't involve as much human interaction?
yeah, it's a great question. I think, part of the empathic behavior is really biological, purely biological, right? We know that psychopaths, let's talk about the extreme, right? So psychopaths, their brains are unable to process important feelings such as fear, right, or sadness. And because they can't process those feelings and emotions, they cannot empathize. They don't know those emotions, so they can't empathize, right? So definitely biology is important, but as we saw, there are more complex cognitive aspects of empathy that can be developed, fostered, is strengthened, right? There are neuronal pathways that can be exercised. And I think the humanistic side of training and learning throughout all disciplines, from engineering, to medicine, to psychology, it cannot be overstated, the need for that. We should make sure that we put a whole lot of focus on the humanistic part of learning and development, not only through the school, high school, but also college and graduate school and so forth. We should always be attempting to remain connected with things that make us humans, right? Art, literature, conversations, engagement with others. And I think by perhaps doing a better job at bringing those opportunities to most people, we can foster more empathy in more people, more empathic behavior. So there are, though, I mean, there are studies showing that some surgeons, actually most surgeons, have a little bit for when they're operating a patient, right? The empathy it's turned off a little bit. You have to cut someone, right? You're in a situation where you have to see that body almost as an object in order to operate. So there are times when you turn on and you turn off your empathic buttons, but definitely something that can be, I would say, exercised. Patty.
Wait, so you're basically saying that people who like struggle at showing empathetic behavior should work to improve that behavior instead of like pursuing a different profession that doesn't involve as much human interaction.
And because I agree with you, a lot of everything we do, right? It's hard not to interact with people. Anything teaching, customer service, you know, I mean, we're always interacting with people. You work at a restaurant, you're working with peers, you're interacting with colleagues, and it's, you know, instead of saying forget about empathy, I think we should try and enforce and monitor, if you can, empathetic behavior, and I wouldn't, and reward empathetic behavior, and make sure that we make it clear how important it is for effective, for an effective, I would say, I'm losing the word here that I want to use, but you know, for you to do whatever it is your job, you have to a great extent to be empathic, to do it well, and you know, to make whomever is in the receiving end of that feel good, right? And that's the last sentence I left you with. Maya's sentence. You have to make people feel good in order for that to be a positive, you know, encounter, I would say. That's how I see it. But of course, there are different views on this.
Okay, thank you. So you gave your take on psychopaths. How do you feel about sociopaths? Because rather than psychopaths who are just unempathetic by nature, people say that sociopaths are unempathetic by nurture. And I feel like I've encountered, I grew up with a handful of sociopaths during my lifetime. So do you think that, like, I'm trying to find the words right now, how a sociopath is, do you think that could be reversed through empathy training, like the training that you just mentioned?
So I'm not a neural behavior scientist. That's not what I do. But I'm curious about it, and that's what I read. I need that the sociopathic behavior is to a certain extent learned, and you know, some neuronal pathways are not strengthened through the process of development. And, you know, but they are there. So it's possible that can be restored. I would say the problem, though, is that same environments that led to that development, right? Of the way that brain thinks, you know, and how it developed, basically, that environment's not going to go away for the most part, right? You were raised in their environment. This is who surrounds you, how you see yourself in that situation. It's not going to be much different. I would say it's hard to make it different. But that's what I read, is that it is reversible. It is trainable. It is reversible. Should I share my slides, Shannon, for the discussion for the actual? Should we go through this?
I was going to share, were you
Okay.
thinking slides that Jaleese had brought up?
Yeah,
Did you have a particular slide you want to go to, or she was going to talk about the framework for overcoming implicit bias?
sure. I think that's a good.
Yeah, the book, pages 52 to 53 here gives the overcoming implicit bias framework. So there are stereotype replacements. Dr. Bruno, would you rather do this? I was just going to read the slides. Unless you had something else you wanted to say.
No, please go ahead.
Okay,
Shannon.
okay. So there are stereotype replacements, which is replacing stereotypical responses with non-stereotypical responses, recognizing that the response is based on a stereotype, not reality. There are counter stereotype imaging, which is spending time thinking about or imagining people you know who don't conform to a stereotype. Individuation, treating people not according to their membership in a category, but according to that person's unique traits and characteristics. And perspective taking, putting yourself in the shoes of a member or of a stereotyped group. So how would you begin to apply this framework to your own work?
Any takers on that?
Well, I'm happy to opine if you like.
Please.
So first of all, this sort of approach I don't think of as four separate things. I'm more of a lumper than a splitter. But my general way of thinking is to recognize that I have a mental model of what this situation is. Okay, and we all have mental models. All of us have mental models, and they are all wrong. They have to be wrong because they are always simplifications of reality. Okay, the question is, what are your assumptions that underlie that mental model? That's what you have to ask yourself. That's what I try to ask myself. And then number two, which I guess is what these four things are really about, is asking yourself, are these assumptions correct? On what am I basing this assumption on? Is there evidence to the contrary? Is it a way of looking that's really not helpful by assuming that all people are rotten? Okay, does that help me be a doctor? Nah, probably not so much. Okay. But it's really more about trying to understand oneself than anything else, I think.
I agree. I think this reflexive, right, approach, and it's really important. And that's when I think the practice of narrative is so interesting, because when you put yourself in a situation when you need to describe or narrate something, you get curious about others and yourself, right? So why is it that this is the way it is? Why is it that I react the way I react? And there are physicians, that actually have the practice of journaling, right? They actually, at the end of the day or the end of the week, they actually write down situations or stressors, and they try and understand what generated or was a culprit for a specific situation, and that helps to sometimes understand what's driving it. But I agree with you. It's all clumped. It's hard for you to provide step number one, step number two. This is what you do. That's what you follow. That's the procedure to get to overcome implicit bias.
Mhm.
Yeah, I want to think holistically. Just give me the steps.
There's a
Yeah.
checklist.
There you go. I think again, we have so many acronyms that we have to remember, at any given time, and I think the idea is there. To respect, to empathize, listen, ask, talk, engage. I mean, you can all of this can be summarized in empathy, right? When you're empathic towards someone, you automatically respect, you listen, you ask, so but it's a nice try at developing, I would say, a checklist of things that can perhaps, by doing this over and over and over again, I would say for some people this may be helpful in promoting in fading away implicit biases. So
Was there anything else not addressed that people wanted to bring up from the book chapter that they read this week in the few minutes we have left? Oh, Patricia said the relate model has to match sincerity. Very true.
Unfortunately, you can fake authenticity. And you can fake sincerity, and you can fake empathy. And while that may be, for some people, helpful in the short term, I find for me that it is quite harmful in the long term. It's harmful in the short term for me too, but
so it's a more profound change, right, David? That's what really.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Your ratings are really high. I'm checking right here for the book.
are they?
Yeah. Amazon.
Oh,
Excellent.
I suggest you don't buy it, but that you download it for nothing. Not because I don't want to make a nickel every time, if that much, but I think it's outrageously priced, and I had an argument with the editor over this.
I would like to ask, if anyone has a particular take onto like honing in empathic behavior. I mean, when you don't feel empathetic towards someone, what do you go back? What do you fall back to in order to rescue that empathy? Anyone has anything to share?
It's hard, but sometimes I try to put myself in their shoes. It's not easy to do because their life is completely different than your life, but it helps. Sometimes I find myself feeling maybe a little annoyed or something, and then I think, wait a second, if I were them, and just mentally put myself in their shoes. Doesn't always work, but
And Clara, do you feel better after you do that? Do you feel that whatever emotion you're feeling, angst or, rejection, or do you feel that that is attenuated after you do that exercise?
Yeah, so it is somewhat. You might have to mentally take yourself a little bit more into, okay, if I were in their shoes, what would I be feeling right now? How would this be like for me? You know, which is, mental calisthenics, and that's not easy to do and it takes time, but yeah, I think it usually makes me feel better. Oh, Dr. Bruno, I was just going to ask you, do you have a LinkedIn profile by any chance?
No,
Well, I was just looking you up before this and I thought, oh, maybe I have her name spelled wrong or something.
no.
Okay.
I should get one, Clara, but I never got one.
So I'm helping Jaleese evaluate this series of things. We're still building that. So you might get a survey about this belatedly, and I apologize for the belatedness of it, but it would really help Jaleese and it would help the CTSC if you fill it out.
Okay, got it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the nudging comment.
Well, thank you. It is 1 o'clock. I wanted to thank Dr. Bruno again for your presentation and facilitation today while Jaleese was out. And we look forward to discussing chapter 3 next week with everyone. We have Dr. Adam Perzinski from the Department of Medicine and Sociology at Metro Health next week. So we look forward to seeing you then. If you wanted to stay on, Hattie, I'll stop recording and everyone can go on their way if you had a question. Dr. Bruno, I don't know if your time allows.